Hey everybody, Pastor Sullivan here with ATP, Ask the Pastor, and today we've got a question about fasting, how to go about it, and probably more importantly, how not to go about it. So anytime you talk about fasting, you automatically have to go to Matthew, the 6th chapter, the words of Jesus. Matthew 6:16-18, he says, "Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." This is the first and most important point about fasting, is it must be done for the proper reason. And the proper reason is not to be seen by others. It is not to increase your reputation. It isn't to be done in front of others so that they see that and look at you and say, wow, that guy must be fasting. Look how spiritual he is. This is the exact opposite of it. Jesus says, this is the Pharisaic way of doing it. This is not the way my followers are to be fasting when they do it. Instead, they are to conceal that, because fasting is not typically, at least, a corporate thing for the life of the Christian. Now, we see that in the Old Testament, but that's a different story. In the New Testament and in the Christian church, then, fasting is to be an individual thing. It cannot be coerced. No one can force you to do it, obviously. And when you do it for yourself, for your own body, not to be seen by others. That's Jesus' first point. So after a couple days of being hungry or having fasted from something else, it's going to become apparent physically with your countenance. Jesus says, don't embellish that. Neither run around in the street saying, hey, I'm fasting, or anything like that. It's not done for other people. It's done specifically between you and God. That brings us to the second point, and that is, what is the real purpose of fasting? The real purpose of fasting is solely to mortify the flesh. It's solely to refrain from something, whether it's food, whether it's some sort of pleasure, some sort of comfort, whatever it is you're fasting from. It's to mortify the sinful flesh. It is to teach your flesh that you will not always give it what it desires. As the stomach desires food several times a day, so the sinful flesh desires, has lusts, has things that it wants, has temptations that it easily welcomes in and easily says yes to. Fasting teaches you how to tell your sinful flesh, no, not going to give you what you want. I'm going to do something else with my body and with my time. So fasting is not something to be done in order to be hyper-spiritual. It's not something that we do in order to get a certain response from God. Some people have mistakenly said things like, well, after 3 days of fasting, after a week of fasting, after 12 days of fasting, then God will grant me a clarity of mind so that I can see the situation that I'm in for what it truly is. Or God will give me the answers I'm looking for if I have a big decision, and he hasn't been giving me any other signs or something like this. That treats God as if he's a vending machine. Something that if you insert the proper coins and if you press the right buttons, then God will give you whatever it is that you think he's been holding back from you. So insert the right prayers, insert the right amount of fasting, and then boom, God will give you what you want. That is the exact opposite reason that the Christian ought to be fasting. God already speaks to you. He speaks to you in his word and in his sacraments, and that's it. Anything else, if you hear God's voice or if God is speaking to you in fasting, that's not God you're hearing. It's probably your own sinful flesh. And again, that goes back to why we fast, to curb the sinful flesh, to mortify our desires, to teach ourselves that we don't have to give our bodies everything at once, that we don't have to give our bodies everything they desire, because we shouldn't. Paul, in fact, in 1 Corinthians 9:27, talks about disciplining his body. He says, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So all it is an outward discipline of the body. Luther makes the comment when talking about this verse, talking about the Matthew chapter 6 verse. He says, fasting does for the body what faith does for the heart. That means it disciplines the body so that we turn away from sin, so that we instead focus on faith towards God and love towards neighbor. That brings us to a few suggestions on fasting. The first is, obviously, if you're on some sort of medication or something like that where you need to be eating food, don't fast. The second recommendation is, if this is at all inclined to puff you up and make you feel more spiritual, don't do it. In fact, you have to be a faithful and humble person already in order to do that, through the Word, through your study of that. Third, I would recommend, if you're going to fast, since you're going to take away either food or some sort of comfort or pleasure, also then add something into that time. So let's just take food. If you're going to abstain from food for a certain amount of time, take that time that you would be devoting to food and instead devote it for time in the Word, the singing of hymns, prayer, praying the Psalms, these sorts of things. That way you're not just taking away just for the sake of taking away, but you're disciplining the body and showing it that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of the Lord. So there's a good biblical way to look at fasting. It's something that people don't do as often as they should. Again, there's no mandate and no one can coerce you to do it, but at the same time, Christ does expect his followers to be doing this from time to time. Matthew chapter 6:16 opens with, when you fast, then this is what you should be like. So when you fast. For you Lutherans out there, remember what you learned in confirmation. Luther says in the 6th chief part of the Catechism on the sacrament of the altar that fasting is indeed good and fine outward preparation for receiving the sacrament. But the best preparation is faith in these words given and shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. So even Luther thought that fasting should be a normal part of the Christian life, as long as it's done to curb the sinful flesh, to show us just how wicked our flesh is, so that we can pray all the more against it, and that we can work all the more to mortify it, to strengthen faith, or rather so that Christ can strengthen faith in us. That's what fasting is all about. So if you've got questions out there that you want answered, send us an email to this address, atpholycross@gmail.com, and we'll answer them as soon as we're able. Until next time.